on your screen shortly. If you do not wish to continue with the session because it is being recorded, we completely understand. But before you go, I will note that we do record these sessions so that we can archive them and post them to our YouTube channel, where we have more than 30 different client enrichment series presentations you can watch on subjects from RWAs, all manners of leasing, not just emergency, space utilization, and more. So if you do not wish to be in this recorded presentation, you can always view it after the fact on our YouTube channel. The link will show up in the chat box. All right, so my name is Eric Fulton. I am the National Program Manager for Customer Outreach and Communications based out of GSA headquarters in Washington, D.C. More importantly, I will be your host for today's edition of the Client Enrichment Series. We have two speakers with us today, both from PBS's National Office of Leasing, and I will encourage them to put the slide deck up so that we can see their names and titles, and I will introduce them now. Our first speaker will be Charlie Johnson. He is a Senior Leasing Program Manager with the Office of Leasing's Center for Program Oversight, Compliance, and Workforce Development. He joined GSA in 2002 as a leasing specialist in Region 3, based out of Philadelphia. And after volunteering to help with disaster relief efforts following Hurricane Katrina, Charlie transferred to Region 4, working out of our Florida office and later in the Atlanta Regional Office. While in Region 4, Charlie was a lease contracting officer, team leader, branch chief, and lease acquisition officer. In 2016, he joined the National Office of Leasing, where he became a national program manager for the disaster leasing program. He's written multiple chapters of the Leasing Desk Guide and the development of multiple lease acquisition models, including the disaster lease model of the new Simplified Lease Acquisition Threshold, that's SLAT if you're familiar with it, model. Our second presenter today is Ken Idle. Ken is a program manager with the Office of Leasing and Center for Program Oversight, Compliance, and Workforce Development as well. Ken has 13 years of contracting experience, first as an intern leasing specialist, lease contracting officer. Ken currently manages the lease acquisition training, LAT, L-A-T, a mandatory training for all lease contracting officers to obtain their warrants, as well as 4 additional lease training programs for the leasing community. Leasing Light Learnings, SME to You, Lease Video Tutorials, and Leasing Conversations. Before I turn the presentation on over to Charlie and Ken, I do want to go over just a few housekeeping notes. First, we do offer closed captioning. We have turned on captions on our end. You can hit the requisite button on yours. There's also a link, I believe, that will go into the chat that will open a new window to follow along closed captioning. As you can tell, we've automatically muted your audio, and that's to help us control the sound quality of the presentation. We are operating in the FedRAMP compliant Zoom for Government platform today. That allows you to customize your view. You can maximize or minimize the viewing area, open the different pods, move things around to whatever suits you the best. I do want to draw your attention to 2 of those pods, the Q&A pod and the chat pod. We encourage you to ask questions of our subject matter experts today during the presentation. And if you choose to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A pod. That is where our subject matter experts will be looking for your questions. They may pull some out and address them during the presentation or answer them in that Q&A pod. The chat pod, which is where you all said hello to me earlier, we're going to use that to share links and information with you. If you have technical questions, questions that are not about the subject matter, you can put them in the chat pod and one of our CES professionals will address it for you. But all subject matter expert questions on emergency leasing, please put them in the Q&A pod. And one other reason we encourage you to do that is whether we get to a question or not, we will download all of those questions, provide answers, and turn that into an FAQ document after the fact, making it available to all attendees. But we can only do that if they are in the Q&A pod. So thank you very much for that. Before we begin today's presentation, we have a little get to know you poll question that we're going to put on the screen here. If you can't see the screen, I'll read it off and you can put your answer in the chat. We just want to know, how familiar are you with GSA PBS basic leasing process? Basic leasing process, not necessarily even emergency. Are you not familiar? Are you somewhat familiar? Are you very familiar? All right. I should hope that we have about 100% participation because this is a get to know you question. And I see the results rolling in, and it looks like, Charlie and Ken, we have a great mix of attendees today. We have 17% or so who say that they are not familiar at all with basic leasing, but we do have a majority of folks here who responded. That's 46% who are somewhat familiar. And then we have our experts, our 37% who are very familiar with basic leasing process. So wherever you are on that spectrum, we will have content that suits you today. You do not need to be an expert to jump right in, though obviously a little bit of subject matter expertise does go a long way. So with that, I am going to step aside and turn over the presentation to our subject matter experts. And our first speaker today is Charlie Johnson. So Charlie, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie Johnson, and I'm going to talk to you today about emergency leasing, which, as Eric said, has been something that I've worked on my whole career. I worked a lot of disasters with FEMA. I worked on Katrina and Ike and Gustav, more recently Hurricane Maria, and countless smaller disasters. And I've been running the disaster leasing program for the Office of Leasing since 2016. So in 2017, we started to look at this concept that, sometimes emergencies happen to agencies that are not named FEMA. Sometimes some things happen, and so we have to have a process to use our very powerful emergency authorities and to apply those to agencies outside of disaster relief and FEMA and what is called the Stafford Act. So we worked for many years on developing that. And in 2020, after going through years of process of getting it formally approved, we issued a brand new chapter of the emergency leasing, brand new chapter of the leasing desk guide, which was emergency leasing. So we're going to talk to you today about what is emergency leasing. We're going to talk about unusual and compelling urgency, which is the engine, that sort of jet engine that drives this process. That's what FEMA's been using all these years to get leases done so fast. Well, we're going to teach you guys how to use that engine a little bit too. And then we're going to do a process walkthrough of the emergency leasing process. And this is where it is very helpful if you are not familiar with our leasing process, that you at least watch the Leasing 101 video that is on the YouTube channel, because we're going to focus today on what is largely what is different. So again, what is emergency leasing? Emergency leasing is a special process using powerful authority called unusual and compelling urgency, which comes to us from the FAR, and sometimes called urgent and compelling. I hear people use that a lot. The formal name is unusual and compelling urgency. So emergency leasing, as you're going to see, follows the same basic process as our standard leasing process, but there are certain steps that are abbreviated and some that we just may omit entirely. So if you are not familiar with Leasing 101, please go over to our YouTube channel and take a look at it. We are going to talk about this as if you are at least somewhat familiar with our leasing process. So if you are not familiar, then there might be some things that aren't quite so clear. Hopefully, maybe later you can watch that Leasing 101 and some of those questions will be answered, or we'll do the best we can to answer questions here. Okay, so unusual and compelling urgency comes to us originally 41 USC 3304A2, which is a fancy word for non-competitive procurement authority. And then it's implemented through Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR 6.302-2. If you are an acquisition professional, you are probably very familiar with FAR 6.302. That is what is called other than full and open competition. Most acquisition professionals are familiar with sole source, which is also under that same section of the FAR, but this is sort of a cousin to sole source. They are similar in some ways and different in some ways, and we're going to talk about how they're different. This special authority is what allows us to go out and award new contracts, whereas sole source in the leasing program is predominantly used for succeeding leases where we already had a lease in place. But this allows us to go out and do new contracts without having to follow the requirements for full and open competition. And it's what allows us to go very fast. So here, on the right-hand side, you see that cars can go really fast. There's ways to speed up full and open competition and to do something very quickly while still meeting the technical requirements for full and open competition. But then there's unusual and compelling urgency, which is that jet engine. And we're going to teach you guys, how do you get access to the jet engine? Because obviously what you can do with that jet engine is going to be, certainly a lot faster than what you can do in that car. All right. So when we talk about urgency, it's important to understand that there's not a singular point of urgency. There's not sort of an on-off switch. Urgency kind of occurs on a spectrum. Everything that the government needs has a certain amount of urgency to it. That's why, it's a government need. It's not a government wish. It is a government need. If you come to us for space, you have a legitimate need for that space, which means that you really need that space sooner rather than later. However, in order to use unusual and compelling urgency, we have to meet a very high bar that has to do with what is called serious injury. And the idea that if we do not use this special authority, the government will incur serious injury. So on the left-hand side, we have our customary government requirements, and these are things that can be provided for in a timely manner. Again, there is some urgency to every government space request, but these can be met while meeting full and open competition requirements by allowing the market a very good and robust opportunity to compete. That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have life-saving and life-sustaining requirements. And these are things that we certainly do run into in the leasing program, especially at the beginning of disasters. When we work with FEMA, we can have certain space requirements that are categorized as that life-saving and life-sustaining, where there is an actual day-to-day need. In other words, they give us a request on Tuesday, and the idea is that they really need this space Wednesday. Every day that it continues to go, there's going to be, certain injury or at least there's a very serious injury that's occurring by not having the space. Perhaps the space is needed to house office operations to get them up and running. Perhaps it's for disaster resource centers or warehousing. So that's all the way on the right-hand side. Somewhere in the middle is where we transition from this, what we can do with full and open competition, to what we need the jet engine for, what we need unusual and compelling urgency. And so again, you see here, there is certainly a lot we can do to speed up a requirement while still meeting full and open competition. But then there's a certain point at which we simply cannot get there fast enough while also following all the rules of the road in that car. You have a speed limit, the speed limit, getting on the highway, maybe 65 miles an hour. We're an acquisition entity. We're not going to go faster than what the law says. So we're going to go 65 miles an hour. That's still very fast, but it may not be fast enough in certain instances. So then we go over to the plane, and the plane can go a lot faster than 65 miles an hour. Okay, so using this authority has a very, very high bar. It requires that we have to be able to establish that any delay in awarding this contract would result in serious injury. It says financial or otherwise. So it could be money, or it could be other types of serious injury to the public. Again, you may need to have services established to the public very quickly, or there may be some other serious issue there. But we have to have a serious injury that will occur if we use full and open competition. Otherwise, if we can get it done with full and open competition, you're likely familiar with the Competition and Contracting Act, and that is what says that full and open competition is the default. So in order to go over to unusual and compelling urgency, there is a fairly high bar that we have to meet. However, we do have processes now in order to use that authority and to use it where we can actually make this justification. As we've said before, unusual and compelling urgency is not the same as sole source. This is something I probably have to clarify several times a year, internally and externally. So if you guys walk away with very little from this, please understand unusual and compelling urgency is not the same as sole source. It's not the same authorities. It's not the same trigger events. It's not applied the same way. It's not conducted the same way. When there's unusual compelling urgency, we are going out and we're still going to seek competition. We may not find it. We'll talk about how market research happens in an emergency later in the presentation, but we're still going to try to find competition. Sole source is where we are establishing a very different justification to say that I'm only going to negotiate with this one source. Typically in leasing, that's an incumbent landlord. But we're going to establish that justification and we're going to say no one else is going to compete for this. I have a justification to only go to one source. Unusual and compelling urgency is where I'm going to go and I'm going to look at the market, but I'm going to move real fast. So if somebody doesn't have time, if somebody can't keep up, if somebody can't get an offer in within the accelerated timeframes, I'm not going to wait for anyone. I'm going to move as fast as I can. We can't use this authority to just arbitrarily pick a building. That's another common misperception. Unusual and compelling urgency does not allow us to go out and just arbitrarily say, I'm going to pick this building because it's blue or because it has my favorite coffee shop in the lobby, and I'm going to ignore anyone else that might be out there. It gives us a lot of power. This is like moving from an axe to a chainsaw. It is a very powerful authority, but it has to be used right. We are an acquisition entity. We always have to think about the integrity of our acquisition program. So we use this sparingly, but it is just like, again, that chainsaw. When we bring it out, we can move real fast. So here's a table that kind of lists these things. Trigger events we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides, but we have full and open competition. What is the trigger event for full and open competition? It's a normal space request. So is there competition? Of course, it's full and open competition. We are going to go to great lengths to make sure that it is open for competition. And the speed. Well, my answer there is well, it's the regular speed. I think we probably get asked more than anything else, how long does the leasing process take? And my standard answer to that is well, how much does a car cost? And then when they kind of think about it, it's, well, what kind of car are you talking about? And then that's my answer. Exactly. How long does full and open competition take? Well, are we talking about 5,000 square feet? Are we talking about 50? Are we talking about 500? Are we talking about office space or a lab? So, how long does it take? Unfortunately, I think we all know it can take a fair amount of time to deliver space through full and open competition. But, again, that's going to be highly based on what your requirements are. With sole source, we go to the middle. The trigger event normally is an expiring lease. We typically are going to use what's called a cost benefit analysis justification. So we're going to look at the cost to stay and the cost to move. And sometimes we just decide that there's so much of an advantage to staying in place that we're not going to offer the contract for competition. We also do occasionally run into very special missions like TSA, where they have a mission-based justification to be at an airport. And I'm going to negotiate with the airport because they have to be there. Is there competition? No. It is faster typically than full and open competition. All the way on the right-hand side, we have unusual and compelling urgency, what we're talking about today, the jet engine. The trigger event is an emergency. There are different types of emergencies. We have a couple slides on trigger events coming up, but you have to have a real legitimate emergency. It is not something that we can use as a customer service tool. It is not something we can use simply because it would be preferential to have the space much faster. We have to meet that very high bar that we talked about of serious injury. Is there competition? Limited. We will certainly seek competition. It is good to have competition both from a business standpoint and also from a FAR standpoint. I mean, we're required to seek competition to the maximum extent practicable. Again, what is practicable in an emergency is sometimes very, very limited. The speed, it's the fastest. When we're talking about those needs all the way at the right end of the spectrum, when we're out with FEMA at the very beginning of an emergency, we can do leases within a couple of days. When we start to talk about, say, long-term emergency space, replacing a long-term lease, and that's what we're going to predominantly focus on today. we're not going to necessarily get it done in a couple of days, because if it's a long-term lease, if we're talking about a 10 or 15-year lease, we are going to have a few more things that we're going to have to go through. If it's short-term lease, we can move a bit faster. Now, as we go through this today, we're going to talk a little bit differently than you might be used to hearing GSA talk to you in these CES presentations. There are some things we're going to say to you that might appear to be a bit blunt. And the reason why is because this authority, using the jet engine, it requires SES level involvement within GSA. And it should require that same level of involvement in your organization. There's a lot of reasons for this that we'll go through throughout the presentation. We're going to ask you to move a lot faster than what you are probably used to and comfortable doing. We are going to be asking the same thing of our people internally. If this is not important enough to get to those senior levels of your organization, it's probably not really an emergency. This authority cannot substitute for management commitment and support. To take advantage of this authority, to do an emergency lease, to take something that takes 18 months to do and get it down to a month, it takes a lot of involvement and support within both sides, GSA and our client agencies. So again, as we go through this, this requires a coalition, it requires a partnership, and it generally requires some very high level directors, SES level support. Because if we're not going to have that, we're not going to get it done. Okay. All right, so now let's do a process walkthrough. And as an important note, you've heard me talk about FEMA, and I love helping FEMA. I love going out and working with FEMA. We're not talking about FEMA disaster leasing today. We're talking about emergency leasing. So what is disaster leasing? Disaster leasing is when we go out and help FEMA after a presidential declaration of disaster under the Stafford Act. This is emergency leasing. Emergencies happen to all agencies. We're going to talk about how do we apply unusual and compelling urgency, that jet engine that drives the disaster leasing process. How do we apply that to agencies that are not named FEMA? So again, if you're here looking for disaster lease information, I'm sorry, that's not what we're talking about. Disaster leases occur under the National Response Framework. They follow a very unique procedural and administrative process, and we're not going to be able to cover those today. We're going to focus on emergency leasing. Now, a couple of key symbols to note. If you saw our Leasing 101, you're familiar with these symbols. If not, we'll go through them here again. On the left, we have our key document. A key document is something that you need to review, approve, or it is a very important notification. In the middle, we have our handshake icon. You already saw that in the slide just a little bit ago. You're going to see as we go through this process, the whole thing is a collaboration, emergency leasing even more so. But there are certain steps that involve significant collaboration between GSA and our clients, and you'll see the handshake icon noting those. On the right-hand side, we have the baton. We try to limit handoffs in our process, but they do happen. And when they happen, typically at the beginning and the end, you'll see that noted with the baton. Okay, this slide should also be familiar to you if you are familiar with the Leasing 101 presentation. It's the same slide. Why? Because it's the same process. We're just going to expedite it a lot. So we'll start with requirements development. We'll go through pre-solicitation. Then we'll put the solicitation package together. In step 4, I'll turn it over to Ken Idle, and he'll go through negotiations, award, and then post-award. So again, it's the same process. It's just going to happen a lot faster. And we're going to talk about how do we make that happen so much faster? How do we take that 12 or 18-month process and get it down to 30 or 60 days? All right, let's start with requirements development. Now, trigger events. Most leasing actions with GSA start off with you calling us because you need new space, but more likely it's us calling you. You're in space and your lease is expiring. So a planning manager is going to reach out to you and start that process. Emergency leases generally are driven by a trigger event, which creates an emergency and urgent need for new space. What are trigger events? Well, they can certainly be natural disasters, a hurricane, an earthquake, a flood, wildfires. These things can damage leased buildings such that we have to relocate you, either temporarily or permanently. So you can have a natural disaster. You can have something that involves, FEMA going out and doing their job, but you could also have an existing leased property that houses a federal tenant that got damaged in a hurricane. We can have man-made trigger events. You can have an attack, certainly, again, terrorism attacks, something that we all have to think about today, arson or other types of just man-made issues. You can have local or building events, water intrusion, a pipe that burst. Pipes can burst. They always seem to burst, Friday at, 2 o'clock or Saturday at 2 o'clock in the morning. Pipes can burst, roofs can leak, fire damage, electrical fires, actual accidental fires. These types of things can damage a building. You can have other types of trigger events that are a little bit different, that there are legislative or presidential orders. You can have an executive order that comes out that says that I want the agency for the enforcement of law to establish these new task forces by a certain date. And in order to do that, they're going to need facilities. And then they come to GSA and they have this deadline that they have to meet, either from legislative action or an executive order. And we look at this deadline and we simply can't get them into space and get them operational in time if we use full and open competition. So again, we're going to move over to using unusual and compelling urgency. The last one is up here is probably the one that is the most subjective, and it is also the one that I would caution is the one that is going to be scrutinized the most. We spent years establishing this process. We certainly do want this new tool in the toolbox to be used, but we want it used responsibly. So if you have a need for space, we can certainly examine a very unique mission critical deadline, something that can be established where we can make that argument of serious harm. The best example of this would be, we have agencies that are involved in providing security for politicians, for political conventions. So if there's going to be some political meeting or a political convention coming up, they come to us and they say, well, the powers that be just decided that the convention is going to be in this area. And, those decisions don't happen 2 or 3 years in advance. So they come to us and they need space, and we'll use this authority to get them space very quickly so that they can provide the necessary security for that political convention or other sensitive event. But again, these types of justifications are the ones that are probably going to receive the most scrutiny. It should not be just something that you would just, I would like this space faster, or it would be nice to have it faster, because again, we're talking about going, not around, but using a established justification process to not use full and open competition, which is required by the Competition and Contracting Act, which is a very important law that is the cornerstone of an acquisition program. So whenever we're going to not use full and open competition, we have to have a very, very good justification for doing so. Okay, Eric, we have our second poll.
We do. It's up on the screen. If you can't see it, I'll read it off to you. And we just learned about trigger events, and we want to know, do you believe your agency is at risk for one or more of these trigger events? No, maybe, or yes. Again, if you can't do the pop-up, in some instances, firewalls prevent that, you can certainly put your answer in the chat, a simple no, maybe, or yes. Do you believe your agency is at risk for one or more of these trigger events? All right, looks like the responses are slowing down. Actually, these numbers mirror the first set of numbers. How funny is that? So we have about 18% who say no. Maybe is the strongest responder with 45%, and then the remainder 37% say Yes, so it looks like we have a mix, but maybe yes have the most responses, guys.
All right. Well, I would tell you, every agency that is out there, you are at risk for at least one of those that we referenced. Perhaps some of you have more risk than others, but again, we definitely want everyone out there to be aware of those types of issues and planning for them. And if you are an agency in the DC area, you're probably involved in that a lot more. If you're an outlying agency, then maybe less so. But again, definitely good to be aware that emergencies can happen to any agency at any time. And one of the things that we're seeing more recently, we used to go through a hurricane season and then we would kind of have a very big cooling off. More recently now, FEMA disasters are a year-round process. We have hurricane season, we have flooding, we have wildfires, we have all kind of things going on. And again, they can certainly impact you in your space. So let's get on to the first thing that will happen if your space is damaged. If your triggered event involves damage to an existing space, the first thing that GSA is going to do is go out and do a damage assessment. That will be done by our field office, by a lease administration manager or a property manager. And they will go out and work with the landlord and start to get an idea of what kind of damages occurred. Now, it's important to keep in mind that landlords are responsible for repairing the leased premises. Landlords are not generally responsible for replacing personal property. So again, if you are a commercial office tenant, you would probably have some sort of commercial insurance. And some of you, when you rented an apartment, maybe you had renter's insurance. Commercial tenants typically have some form of insurance. The federal government does not purchase insurance. We are essentially what is called self-insured because we're the federal government. So they are not responsible for replacing your personal property in most instances. So we'll work with the lessor to look at their remediation and repair plan. Now, the second bullet here talks about something that I think years ago, like when I started working on these procedures back in 2017 and no one knew what COVID was, this was a much more sensitive issue. All of us have now gone through essentially years of telework. So I would imagine that this is no longer such a major sticking point, but agencies should be ready, and you should have a plan ready to utilize telework and other types of remote options so that you can continue working for short periods of time while repairs happen. Because we certainly do want to use an emergency lease as a last resort. We don't want to default to using an emergency lease. We do want to give the landlord an opportunity to fix the building and for you to move back in and go back to work. If you look at our lease boilerplate, we do have a clause that gives landlords up to 270 days to repair damage, provided that they can give us a reasonable schedule within 60 days. Now, that 60 days is part of the 270. It is 270 days from the event of the destruction. It is not 270 plus 60. But again, they have 270 days from the event of destruction or damage to repair or restore the premises. Within that first 60 days of the 270, they need to give us a schedule, and we have to look at it, and it has to be a reasonable schedule. There have certainly been times where we look at the schedule and say, you can't repair this within 270 days, in which case, certainly if we do not believe that they can repair it within 270 days, we don't have to wait 270 days to start to look for something else. But we do need to give them those 60 days. And we really do want to give landlords every reasonable opportunity to fix the space and for us to just stay, because it's the right thing to do. It's certainly going to be generally less disruptive for you as the tenant agency if you can just move back into your own space. And most of the time when damage happens, it is something that can be fixed within 30 or 60 days. Generally, we don't really see things going out to that 270 mark that often. But again, 270 days is the maximum amount of time that they have. So once we decide that we do need to get you a temporary or permanent emergency space, we're going to have to do some requirements development. And this is where, we have to first decide, what are we doing? Are we doing a temporary relocation where we're going to move you back eventually? Or is this a brand new permanent relocation? We're going to go do a 5 or 10 or maybe even a 15-year lease. If you have a building that is partially damaged, it can generally be fixed. Maybe temporary space is needed. Again, I would suggest very highly that you have to leverage telework. You have to leverage remote work as much as possible. Most agencies now, having gone through COVID, have very good telework capabilities. Building that's completely destroyed. You could have, again, a serious wildfire that goes through an area, maybe the whole building is destroyed. You could, again, certainly have an electrical fire or an accident and the whole building is destroyed. If we're just looking at a building that's been destroyed, we know that they cannot rebuild it within the time frame required. I mean, if we're just looking at nothing. So again, we don't necessarily have to wait until the 271st day if we know they can't get it done. We'll go ahead and start working on getting permanent relocation space. Now, short-term requirements should look to replicate minimum mission-critical functionality, something that you cannot do through remote work options. If you have a certain public interface component, that may be something that we have to replicate because, again, we certainly want to reconstitute those services to the public as soon as possible, but your back of house functions can probably just operate remotely until we get the space repaired and we move you back in. Long-term requirements, we need to kind of pause a little bit. Let's say you've been in 30,000 square feet and that's, you started that 15 years ago. You probably don't need 30,000 square feet today. And if we're going to do a long-term replacement lease, we want to look at your current and your future space needs and not just default to the fact that you were in 30,000 square feet, so we're going to go get you 30,000 square feet. So how long does this take? Well, advanced planning can certainly help. And if you are an agency in the DC area, you are required to have some of these plans in place called reconstitution. However, again, if you are out in another area, maybe you don't have a plan in place for what happens if your space is damaged in an emergency. So again, this is where we're going to stop. Sometimes, the urgency of a situation can cause people to want to go out literally tomorrow. Again, they say, well, I had 30,000 square feet. Let's go find 30,000 square feet. We need to get this done. Let's go get in the car and look for space. Sometimes this is where cooler heads prevail. And certainly as you go through these disasters and you work with FEMA, you kind of have to learn to keep a cool head, even in these emergency situations. And so this is a time when you need to pause, even though sometimes pausing is counterintuitive in an emergency. If we're going to get short-term space for you, it's short-term. The commitment of the government is short-term. So we can probably come up with some requirements. Maybe that takes us a couple of days. If we are going to do a new long-term replacement lease for you, we're certainly going to move as quickly as we can. It probably will take a week. It might take a few weeks. That is all going to have a lot to do with internally what you guys can do within your agency. It certainly will mean our people are going to be working on this. This is going to be an everyday issue for somebody. And that's another key component. We get back to that idea of management support and prioritization. When we have an emergency and we're trying to help you, we're not going to meet with you for an hour and then have a meeting a week later. This is going to be somebody's day-to-day job trying to get you guys up and running again. And it's going to need to be that important within your agency as well. So we're going to start working on these requirements. We're going to move very quickly, but we don't want the urgency of the situation to cause us to make a bad business decision that we're going to have to live with for years. So again, we're going to take a moment. We're going to come up with a plan, and then we're going to execute the plan. What is our acquisition strategy? Well, unusual and compelling urgency. That's why we're here. So when we're going to do an emergency lease, we're going to use unusual and compelling urgency. And that's going to allow us to move very quickly. The specific situation and level of urgency may cause us to either abbreviate or omit steps. And we'll talk about some of those steps and how we make some of those decisions. Now, as we go through this, it is important that you have a schedule. The worst thing you can do is try to do an emergency lease where everybody just says, okay, we're going to go as fast as possible and get it done. That is a good way to create a mess. All projects, including emergency lease projects, need a project manager, and all project managers know that you need a schedule. So when we're going through and we're creating this schedule, it's going to be very important that we are kind of working outside of our comfort zone. Because in order to expedite this process, we're going to have to do a lot of things internally that are a lot faster than we're used to doing them. It's going to require the same kind of commitment within your agency as well. RLP reviews are going to have to be done very quickly. We're going to talk about DID workshops a little bit later, how we can get DIDs done in a day or two as opposed to weeks. Construction drawing reviews, all of these things, you're going to have to kind of take what is normal and just throw it out the window. Your security team needs 2 weeks to review drawings. I'm sorry, that's not going to work here. This is an emergency. That's again where that SES level leadership might be necessary to say, this has got to be prioritized. You're going to have to do this work a lot faster than what you're used to. Again, hopefully it's about taking a good review, but just doing it a lot faster. It might have to move in front of other projects. Those are the things that we're going to be doing internally. You're going to need to do those same things in order to actually make this authority work. Now, where it's possible, it's best to abbreviate a step rather than just skip it. Advertising is one of those things. There's a big difference between advertising for 5 days and not advertising at all. Typically, we would advertise for a month, but again, if this is an emergency, we might advertise for a limited amount of time. There's also a cost to balancing, a cost to expediting a schedule that has to be balanced. And that's where we have to constantly think about this. We have to think about what is feasible. There's lead time items. Nowadays, there's supply chain issues. These types of things may limit what is possible. You might have a lot of overtime labor. Those things cost a lot more. So if you take build out that would normally take 6 months and you try to do it in 4 months, you can expect to pay more. When we're negotiating or bidding, we still have to give we still have to give landlords time to just read things. We don't want to scare them off by saying, give me a bid in an hour. We still want to give them a little bit of time to look through things and to be comfortable with signing the business commitment. Okay, do we have any questions in the chat?
Hey, Charlie. Yeah, I've been taking a look through these. Hopefully I got some somewhere in the chat and they moved over to Q&A and somewhere just in the chat. So I'll try to tackle all the ones that came through for you here. Is the lack of planning or foresight adequate reason enough to use the urgent and compelling authority?
No. That's the simple answer to that. Lack of planning or foresight just simply does not do it. We're going to have to establish that there is going to be serious harm to the government's interest, which again, serious harm, not, that word is in the FAR. It is a very purposeful word, serious injury. It says financial or otherwise, but again, a lack of planning or just we didn't get to this in time. No, is not going to work. It'll have to, we'll have to establish a much, much higher bar.
There's a question here or two about the delegation process when using this method. I know we have a center for that. Do we have any comments about how delegations work under this methodology?
So when there is an emergency, there is a categorical delegation for short-term emergency space, And you would work with our delegations office as far as notifying them that you believe you have an emergency, and they would walk you through what is going to be required. You're still going to need to put everything into GREX. You're still going to need to walk through the GREX delegations module. But if it is a true emergency and it is short-term space, again, not 5, 10, 15 years, but if we're talking about something that's a year or less, there is a categorical delegation for emergencies that does allow somebody to go and get an emergency lease for space. But again, still working with our delegations group.
Yeah, so question here, if a client is relocated to a swing space due to extensive flooding, would this trigger the emergency leasing, and would the swing space be considered permanent?
Well, I guess the question would be more so what is the need? So if you have flooding, we're going to go back to that idea that your existing space was damaged. Are they going to be able to get your space fixed within that 270 days? If they are, then we first off should really be looking at maybe teleworking or something else. But if we decide to do a short-term emergency lease, it would be short-term and you would return to your space when it is repaired. If you have such major damage that it cannot be repaired within 270 days, that is when we would start talking about acquiring, permanent replacement space for you. So it's going to have to do with how long the damage is going to take to be repaired.
So here's a question about building class. It says, does the Class A space definition requirements and assessment procedures still apply in emergency leasing? I guess, kind of this could boil this question down to, is building class in any kind of consideration when it comes to, doing an emergency or urgent lease?
Well, I think it's important to note that GSA does not require Class A space. We do require that it is a building of modern construction, and there's a lot of language that is in our lease template, but we don't require Class A technically. I mean, Class A is sort of a marketing convention. Buildings can call themselves Class A, and maybe you would agree with that, or maybe you wouldn't. But we don't really require Class A. What we do require is the building is a modern and sound construction, and our normal requirements for space certainly do apply to disaster and emergency leases, because it's still a human being. It's a government employee that is going to walk in the door, and we want the space to be safe. We want to make sure that we're going to talk about some of our due diligence reviews in a couple of slides. But again, yes, I mean, the building is going to have to be of sound construction. I mean, we certainly don't want to put somebody in space that is not safe.
Yeah.
All right, let's take one more, and then I think we need to move into the next section. We can maybe come back and get some more later.
Let me pick this one because I thought it was kind of interesting. One of the questions was about how, in some cases, some of the higher level folks in the organization may not know as much about the lease acquisition process as the practitioners in the field. What are some of your kind of best practices to, get those higher level folks on board for, what they would have to go through and sign and approve and review, as you move into this type of procurement method?
I mean, best practices as far as getting your management on board with this, I guess that's a interesting question. I mean, if this is an emergency, hopefully your senior management is aware. If we have an office lease in, Wichita, Kansas, and there's an electrical fire and it burns down, then the idea would be that you're hopefully at least at your 15 level, they're going to be aware of that. We have an office building that's burned down. We're going to need to figure out what to do with the employees and our mission and how we're going to get work done. As far as getting that 15 and that SES level support, the best practices is really you within your agency. I mean, you have to obviously be able to sell this as an emergency within your own agency. I mean, if you can't get your own agency senior leadership on board, then I mean, even more so, again, I'd have to question, is this really something that needs to be considered an emergency and needs to be considered for an emergency lease? I mean, there are bad things that happen. And, again, there could be, something that happens that requires, some leasing action. There can be partial damage that needs to be repaired. Not all of those things are going to create a need for an emergency lease.
You said that's the last question you wanted to take for now?
Yeah, let's, I mean, because we can certainly, as we get through, I mean, if we don't answer your question now, when we get to the end, if we, we have enough time, we'll answer as much as we can. But I want to make sure we get through all of the slides first. And if we don't answer it live, we certainly can answer it in a Q&A document later. All right. Let's go on to pre-solicitation. So for those of you who are familiar with our leasing 101 or just the leasing process, pre-solicitation is the process of engaging the market in order to find out what properties are out there. And we do that using a number of tools. We can place an advertisement on sam.gov. We might not do that in an emergency, or we may place one for a limited time. We have access to some very good online databases such as CoStar that allows us to simply type in some search parameters and find out what space is out there in your market for lease. But in an emergency, telephone outreach becomes very, very important, because what we want to do is talk to these building reps, and we want them to understand, and this is an emergency. A lot of people in the private sector that are used to dealing with GSA are used to our standard process. They're used to the idea of this leasing process happening over the course of months. And so we want to let them know this is a very different situation. So if we place an ad, maybe we place it for 5 days. I think that that's always a best practice, even in an emergency. It can certainly help, because maybe somebody sees the ad and maybe they have some space that might not be in CoStar. You might not know who to call. Certainly placing an ad for even a couple of days can really help, but we don't necessarily do that all the time. But when we talk to people, when we do the telephone outreach, we're going to let people know that, this is an emergency lease. We're going to be looking to move very quickly. And that's because a lot of times people can post space. If you're in the private sector, if you're a landlord, you are going to post space that may not necessarily be immediately available. That's because if you have a tenant and they tell you, I'm going to move out in two months or 3 months, you don't want to wait until your space is vacant to advertise it. So you might be advertising space as available that is not necessarily immediately available. And those are the types of things that we'll find when we just call people. So here we have a slide that talks about kind of what happens when we do market research in an emergency. If this was a regular lease, we might go to the market and we might find 6 properties. We might find that 2 of them don't work for whatever reason. But in a regular lease, we would have a pool of 4 offerors. Well, in an emergency situation, unfortunately, we can find ourselves much more limited than we would be, because again, we're looking for space that is available immediately. So you might have of our 4 regular offerors that would normally be interested in competing, we might have one that has a tenant in place. We might have one that has institutional ownership, and they just simply can't put an offer together in a week. They're not built that way. That can absolutely happen. You might have a situation in this slide, I left it where there's 2, because again, competition is certainly better. It's better because of business reasons. It's better because the FAR, of course, says that we're supposed to promote competition to the maximum extent practicable. But certainly it's good to have competition. But you know what? It just as easily in this situation, we could have had one of these, these 2 that are left. Maybe it's a short-term lease. Maybe it's just temporary space. And so especially in a tight market, we say, I need space for a year. They might say, I'm sorry, I'm just not interested. I got, people calling me for 3 and 5 year deals. Why do I want your 1 year deal? So this is where I think sometimes even internally, this can look like a sole source. And I think that's what causes some of the confusion. It's not a sole source. It is not just point at the building, all the way to the right and go. If we have a second building that wants to compete, we really have to allow them to compete. And we want them to, because certainly putting all your eggs in one basket, as they say, is, it's not a good idea. We can start working with that one offeror all the way to the right, and they might come back with all kinds of problems and issues. And then if we have another person, we don't waste a lot of time. We just say, okay, well, look, I'm sorry, but this is probably not going to work out because you want, a 5-page writer added to this lease full of all kinds of language we can't agree to, or you want, double market, and we're certainly not going to do, that kind of a premium. So again, competition is always in our best interest, even in an emergency. So let's go to emergency market surveys. Again, this is where I'm going to say some things that I'm sorry might appear to be blunt, but it is our normal policy that decision makers for agencies are supposed to be available and ready to sign market survey forms. That doesn't always happen in our regular leasing program, even though that is our policy. When we're talking about an emergency lease, your decision makers need to be available. If they're not available, then somebody else needs to be ready to go. This is again where that top level management support. You might say, well, the office manager can't make it that week. Well, then who else is going to go? Because if we start pausing and backing up market surveys or doing a second market survey a week later, we have really eroded the benefit of using this authority. So this is again where we talk about, there's a lot of things that you're going to have to do internally to make sure that we leverage the value of this authority. And again, might take you out of your comfort zone. So we might do market research where, to make it very simple, let's say we finish our requirements on a Monday. And then, we're already out looking in the market. It's Tuesday, maybe Wednesday or Thursday. We want to do a market survey. Your decision makers need to be prepared. We're going to be moving a lot faster than we're used to. In order to actually really leverage this authority, you're going to have to be prepared to. And that might mean that if someone can't be available, then okay, well, who's going to go in their stead? Who is going to be on the market survey, or are they just going to have to simply defer? The office manager can't be there. Okay, well, who's going to get the assistant office manager? I mean, certainly they have to be reasonably competent. All right, we are back to questions. Let's take a couple more questions. I think we are doing good on time.
Yeah. I know we're not talking a lot about disaster leases here, but are there any funding concerns or differences between disaster and emergency leases?
So disaster leases come with funding through the Stafford Act, which goes to FEMA. So, I mean, and then FEMA might distribute funding to agency partners through the National Response Framework, which they do through what's called a mission assignment. So, for example, they mission assign GSA to go get space for them, or they mission assign EPA to do certain things for them. And so, again, there certainly can be money that comes to them through the disaster declaration. But if you're talking about an emergency in the context of emergency leasing, this is not associated with a Stafford Act disaster declaration. So, I mean, this is something that, yes, you're going to have funding for. And that's another it's a very good point. I'm glad the question was asked, because again, this is also where, yeah, this top level management support becomes very important. You might need to scrape your budgets if you need money Or again, this is also where, we talk about looking at especially temporary space, just minimum functional requirements, trying to stay within your tenant improvement allowance as opposed to coming up with RWA money. But certainly, there is no special money that comes to you as a result of doing an emergency lease. In a disaster declaration, there's money that comes through the Stafford Act, which is administered by FEMA. But again, if you are in an office building, Wichita, Kansas, and there's an electrical fire, it burns down, there's no special money that comes simply because there was an emergency that happened to your space.
So you mentioned the 270-day language in the lease. What if that landlord also has poor past performance? Is there any kind of combination that can be applied to negative past performance and a 270-day requirement for those failures to rebuild?
We're going to have to look at the schedule, and I mean, if they have bad past performance, I'm not sure that we would be able to say that we could apply that to this situation. We're going to look at the schedule. They have to give us a reasonable schedule within 60 days. So we're going to look at what's reasonable. If they give us a reasonable schedule, then we're going to monitor it. So if they're supposed to be hitting certain benchmarks and they're not hitting those benchmarks, we don't have to wait until the 271st day if we find them falling behind. So we'll be monitoring that build out, and when they start to miss critical deadlines of their schedule, then we can start to take certain preemptive action.
So what about a length requirement? Is there a maximum length requirement for one of these emergency leases, or a maximum length?
So, I mean, there is no maximum length of an emergency lease other than our normal 20-year statutory authority. I mean, we did some emergency leasing after 9/11. We've certainly had other cases where we've done emergency leases. And again, we do 10. If it's going to be permanent replacement space, then it can be, a 10-year lease. It could be 15 years. It could be 20 years. If it's short term, then so much the better. If we're going to move you back into your space, then it would be matched, to what we think you might need. We've had situations where hurricanes have damaged federal buildings, and we've had to move tenants out of federal buildings. And because of the damage, maybe it's going to be 3 years before we move them back, in which case we're going to try to get a lease that's closer to that 3-year term. Maybe it's 5 years with termination rights after 3, but we'll try to match it to what is needed. As far as the maximum length, I mean, the maximum length is just, is our normal 20-year authority.
Like a couple possible general clauses type questions here. What are the rent requirements when moving into temporary space? Is the agency responsible for both rents?
So when we are moving out of space that's been damaged, we don't normally pay rent. I mean, again, there's, these things can get complicated, but if you have, let's take the classic example that I've been going with. You have an electrical fire. We can't use the space. It's nothing we did. It's just, this happened. Or, a wildfire that impacted the whole area, flooding that impacted the whole area. When we can't use the space, we do not generally pay rent. So you're not normally going to be in a situation to have to pay double rent. Okay. All right, let's leave it at that. And again, we'll continue to work through this Q&A as we go through these slides. And I think, if we have time, certainly at the end, we can just, get through as many of them as we can. All right, step 3, solicitation. It's actually very short, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken. So as we're going through reviewing this, I tell my LCOs, even in a regular situation, it's certainly a best practice to review the RLP with the tenant agency in a collaborative fashion. Again, we certainly have, lots of screen sharing technology now. We have Zoom, we have, Google Meet, we have, Teams. We have access to all of these different collaborative tools, so much more so than we ever did before. So when you're looking at the RLP, it's a good idea to do it in a collaborative fashion, but we're moving very fast. So again, this is where get all, within the agency, get your folks together, get the security expert, get them on the line. We'll take 2 hours, we'll go through the lease. Maybe they're used to having a week. Again, you're going to have to come out of your comfort zone. So we're going to go through the RLP. We're going to look at the square footage range. We're going to agree. And this is something that hopefully has already been discussed when you came up with your project schedule at the beginning, but we're going to agree on the timing and the process for post-award design development. Something that, again, normally takes a lot of time. We're going to have to speed that way up, but we have to make sure as we go through the RLP and the lease document that everything matches up. We also want to make sure that we capture your special requirements, your unique requirements. If you can't be on the first floor, or maybe you really have to be on the first floor, we want to make sure we capture those things. When you're moving quickly, risk goes up. Project risk goes up. As project risk goes up, you have more chances to make a mistake. So this is a very important time, again, to pause, even though that can be counterintuitive, but pause and go through the RLP package. Go through it thoroughly. If it takes you half a day, just, block off that morning. We're going to take 4 hours. We're going to go through this thing, but when we're done, we're going to have an RLP package that's ready to go on the street, and not, 2 weeks later, we're going to have an RLP package after that, after that day. Those are the types of accelerations that have to happen to take advantage of this authority. So now with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ken. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. He's going to share his, and I'm going to let him take you through the rest of this.
All right. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So thanks, Charlie. So, from here on out, I'm going to be taking you through, the post RLP issuance in the emergency lease process. Before I get started with the particulars of the process, we did the poll at the beginning, and it looked like about, 60 or so are familiar or very familiar with the leasing process. So perhaps this part that I'm going to talk about kind of applies to those folks the most. But I think it's an important facet to talk about in this particular action. So before I get started with the particulars of the process, I just want to kind of tell a quick story of that I think speaks to one of the main challenges that has to be overcome in emergency leasing. So like a lot of folks over this latest July 4th holiday, I went on vacation. I had a rental car the whole week I was gone. And then when I got back in my regular vehicle. I've literally driven that vehicle for 20,000 miles. But that first day back, I was reaching for handles and buttons where they would be for that rental car. And kind of reminding me how helpful and sometimes unhelpful, our muscle memory is, or Charlie was saying that comfort zone is. And so I think this presentation's goals, of course, to inform about emergency leasing process, but also to provide some, warnings and some checks about where we need to break that muscle memory or that comfort zone of the traditional process and get into how things are different when you're dealing with emergency actions. And I think this goes both ways. And there are going to be likely times where you're going to be, where you and your LCO on the project are going to have to kind of shake each other out of old procurement routines and continually brainstorm, how can I deliver this faster? Because traditional procurements can sometimes, drive themselves because the RLP and lease are so well defined on performance spec and construction times, and of course there can be a number of float points in a traditional build out schedule. But it's been my experience in these emergency actions that you need continual brainstorming and problem solving with those mini meetings between yourself and GSA and multiple times during each phase that you're working through. So this slide is an example of something that can be kind of LCO muscle memory, the amount of time and consideration of the RLP. So typically it's a minimum of 20 calendar days. However, in the emergency process, it should be shorter and dependent on the needs of the project. Of course, we need to provide enough time for, the potential offeror to digest the information. We don't want them to drop out of the running because they get a 50-page document and feel overwhelmed by a quick deadline. But it should not necessarily default to the 20 days, and it can be a time savings versus the traditional method. So the issue identified in this slide is a major theme of emergency leasing, once you begin interfacing with the market, whether for the space itself or later during construction. The key question is, and often is, when and to what extent should we pay higher than normal rates? So urgency and quicker delivery, does cost additional money. It's absolutely true. But, not necessarily on all things at all times either. And it definitely doesn't mean that money is no object. The prices need to be considered fair and reasonable, and the LCO must be extra diligent to understand that balancing act between price and delivery time, not to incur any unnecessary waste. Emergency leases, I think I saw this in the Q&A, they're not exempt from the audit and review process. However, due to the emergency, things do have to get done faster and quicker. So my recommendation to you all here is to internalize that, famous John Wooden quote during the price review, which is, be quick, but don't hurry. And finally, don't try to operate in a vacuum when making decisions about these cost and price items. Quick coordination with a pair of neutral eyes, whether it's a independent government estimator or a teammate with experience with the current market trends, can definitely save you from making a questionable decision in those short timeframes that you have to turn around the documents. So, there's certainly trade-offs that can be made in every project, and especially in emergency actions, but one that cannot be made is the safety and security of the occupants in that space. So, these due diligence checks here must always be made on every procured space. And this is something that project managers should highlight in red before they even kick off, because this can be a gateway item that can hold up the entire project. My recommendation here, similar to a lot of Charlie's recommendations early, is get your internal people, those critical folks, in place early and often in your project plan. Get buy-in from them about the importance of their quick turnaround on items, no matter what level they are in the organization. And then finally, especially talking about these owners' capability to perform items, ensure your offeror or offerors, if you have more than one, know these things are coming and to be prepared for them as well. And this final bullet on this slide is critical due to protests and potential delays on award. If there is something in the RLP that is a requirement of the action, and it could be a relatively small item, such as no more than 3 walkable blocks to the nearest bus stop, or no more than 2 walkable blocks to food establishments, those must be in place for that lease or that RLP or offer to be technically acceptable. So please make sure everything in that RLP, I know we didn't talk a lot about RLP creation, but you must or should make sure that everything in there is absolutely necessary. If you don't need walkable blocks to things, be sure those things don't find their way into the final RLP, because they will be boxes that you have to check when it comes to these due diligence items, and could either totally throw your procurement on the side and go sideways with it, or potentially not award to somebody who's ready to go, and it would be the best possible option for your group. So generally, like most of our deals, this is or this will be a lowest price technically acceptable LPTA award. The ideal is no deviations from the base RLP when you get it back, no strike throughs from the offeror, and the one with the lowest price with no deviations will be the winner using the evaluation language in the document. An important note here is that a negotiation period may not be needed, may not be required if the initial offers are fully responsive and within market. That's a facet of this particular method that can be a time savings for you when it comes to getting these offers back and forth. All right, so this slide is an overview of what to expect once an apparent successful offeror is identified. The GSA team will work on 2 tracks, one to inform the client agency of the deal via the recommendation letter in the OA, and the external track, which assembles and sends out the final lease draft to the apparent successful offeror for review and signature. This is another one of those gates that will possibly need coordination from the team to ensure no unnecessary delay. My recommendation is don't wait until the OA is in your inbox to let your approvers know that it's coming if you're not the approver. And then when that RLP goes out, prep whoever's on your team that a financial document is impending, is coming soon. Also make sure they know this is not a typical procurement, or remind them that it's not a typical procurement. An attempt to get buy-in that you should be able to, skip the queue and fast pass your way to hopefully that final signature, so you can get it turned around as quickly as possible. So once all the lease paperwork is completed and signed, all parties will receive a copy of those documents. And ideally, there's very little delay between the execution of that document and the post-award process. So now $1 million question, how long does that take? Well, you can see some of the possible timelines here. We have, maybe a week for requirements, a week for market research and survey, 1 to 4 weeks for solicitation negotiation, and a week for award. The key to hitting those timelines, I know Charlie and I have been preaching this throughout the session today, is, buy-in at all levels of the agency. Have your support services ready, have your support services on standby to fulfill their critical roles. And ultimately, as a pre-check to this is a thoughtful analysis of what your group absolutely needs in an emergency situation. Because if you only have very minor cosmetic changes that you need to make in that space, you could be done right here, 30 to 60 days in your new space. You can be occupying in 1/2 or maybe more practically 1/4 of the time it would take than if you needed alterations that require permitting and drawing. So, as is space can be incredibly fast with this procedure. So do we have any questions on that part?
All right, we do certainly have still some questions in here. Let me see if I can.
I skipped around.
What is, well, we'll answer a couple of these here. I think there might be still some coming in on the second half. There's a question about parking. Can parking be stipulated?
Well, I've definitely done just parking by itself, or parking within the emergency lease.
I think it's basically, can we stipulate parking that is available within a certain walkable distance?
Sure. Just again, know that whatever you put in that RLP, you're going to have to check in the due diligence process. And if you accidentally forget it, or if you don't check it as something that is technically acceptable, then they didn't meet, they're not technically acceptable to the RLP. So you run yourself a risk of, having something in there. Just be sure that you need it. If you don't need it, it shouldn't be in there.
Right. And we do generally have requirements about parking being available within a certain walkable distance. So that's very normal for our regular leasing process. And it certainly would be something that would be normal for an emergency lease as well. When you're in remote or suburban areas, a lot of times it'll be available at a parking lot that's right there. When you're downtown, it certainly can be something that we require within so many walkable blocks. So yeah, that's a very normal thing to do. Okay. There's one here that I think, what is the level of participation or approval required from SES level folks? What is it that they're exactly going to need to do? That they're going to become project sponsors. So they're not going to necessarily have to, specifically sign anything in particular. I will tell you, our SES level officials generally do. If we're doing an emergency lease over 1 year, our head of the contracting activity, which is an SES level official, generally our regional commissioner, will have to sign what's called a determination of exceptional circumstances. As far as an agency level SES participant, there isn't necessarily a specific document that they would have to sign, but it's just about that idea of having SES or 15 level senior level support within your organization, mainly so that when you hit roadblocks, that you have somebody that has significant amounts of authority, of line authority. Again, that idea that somebody might want 2 weeks to review something. And again, you might need to have a management official that says, I'm sorry, you're going to need to do this within 2 or 3 days. So there isn't necessarily a document that they sign. It's more about, again, being a project sponsor and being involved to help to get over those roadblocks. All right. Here we go. There's another question. How is accessibility compliance incorporated with emergency leasing?
I might leave that one to you, Charlie. I would, just use the standard forms and everything that I have always done with the ABAS requirements. There's no.
Correct. Yeah. ABAS is a part of ABAAS is a standard requirement, and part of what we're trying to say here is even though it is an emergency lease, we're not going to waive, certain accessibility issues. We're not going to lease space that is not accessible. We're not going to lease space that is not safe. So the same accessibility compliance would be incorporated in an emergency lease as a normal lease. We're not going to put people in space that might not work for them or might not be safe. All right. I think let's go ahead and go through the rest of the presentation. We do have some additional questions here, and I think we'll have a good amount of time at the end to answer a bunch of these.
Cool. All right, so now we're at the final stage of the process, the post-award, where we design, build, and accept the space. I mentioned earlier that it's been my experience that good urgent leasing typically has multiple mini meetings in each phase with the key players in the group, to both shake each other out of that comfort zone of the traditional process and to just keep asking each other questions and presenting ideas about how to make things go faster. I'll say that we've been talking about SES level involvement here and the different sign-offs that you have at those various levels. And I'm certainly sympathetic to the folks on the call today that that might not have those levels engaged in their real estate procurement in most cases. But this is an excellent example of what those extra steps that you would probably need to take in this urgent leasing process. You may need to have more meetings with them in the course of this procurement to make sure they know what's going on. They're kept abreast of all the situations that you are experiencing and that you predict that you're going to be experiencing, all the risks that are coming up. And the post-award process has a number of opportunities to potentially make things go faster. But it does take that significant collaboration. And hopefully, as this, the final bullet on this slide notes, the earlier requirements development process, hopefully was deeply considered and the need for any build out to get ahead of the game. So at this point, you need to understand that any changes that you make can have cascading delays that take away from the benefits of using the emergency process, right? You were using this process because there was a trigger event that disrupted your group's ability to accomplish the mission. It was one of the ones that were significant enough to be able to hang your hat on. And any delay possibilities should come with a very thorough review of how it does affect your ability to get back to normal work. One of the areas that you potentially could save a lot of time here is utilizing the DID workshop. So, this method of creating DIDs has become, pretty popular even in the main, regular leasing process. And, it's even more important and useful here. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that it probably should be mandatory in an emergency lease action because, the other process, the iterative process of sending things back and forth just, eats up so much time, and you just don't have that kind of time in this action. If you've never been part of a DID workshop before, it's a compression of the process that can take weeks to months to complete in that other option, the iterative model. And yet this DID workshop can be done in a 1 to 2 day period. It typically involves getting everyone in one place at one time and sketching out where walls and furniture and outlets go. And ultimately the goal is to walk out of that meeting with an approved DID, ready to send over to the landlords, architect, and engineers to create those construction drawings. I think the key points to execute this well in emergency situation are, very similar to the ones before it, right? get buy-in from your stakeholders, including organized labor groups that might be a key part of your design process. Ensure all the decision makers are able to, sit at the table for these meetings, so you don't have to, lose extra days looking for signatures and approval. And finally, and I know Charlie emphasized this earlier, prepare for folks where if they can't be there in person, that they can be there virtually, or find their backups, way ahead of time of the actual meeting dates to, sit in their chair and be sure that they can provide the proper approvals. So this is a reminder of what it takes to perform, each of the design steps. So we just talked about the DIDs. Well, what do they consist of? They usually have, they lay out the lines for the drawings of the space, right? So they reflect all the lease requirements. They show partitions and doors. They have a demo plan, voice, data, electrical outlets, finishes, the generic furniture layout, and any additional details necessary to communicate the design intent to the lessor's architect and for the purpose of creation of the construction and drawings. One absolutely critical line to draw here is we do approve the DIDs. You can see the government approves the DIDs, hopefully at the DID workshops that we have and we talked about earlier. And then ultimately, we give those over to the landlord and their professional team to create construction drawings, or CDs. And the construction drawings are the A&E created drawings from which the trades create the space. In the old days, these were like, these were the items that you'd roll up and put in those long cardboard tubes and, maybe have to make copy on the massive plan copy machine in the office. Well, nowadays, a lot of these plans come, the trades use iPads with digital docs that they have in their corners of the spaces they work at all times during the installation. Once these plans are stamped and approved by the municipality. The important note on this one is, we only review and provide comments on CDs. We don't approve them. We don't take any technical responsibility. The landlord must always accept and retain the responsibility for the technical specs and design of the building system. We don't want to give any indication that we are, helping design it or we're approving the design of it. They must, the responsibility of that must retain with the landlord. And finally, the tenant improvement negotiation. This step usually takes place on a concurrent timeline as the permit review process of the final CDs. And this is where, the landlord gets bids on the CDs from 2 or more general contractors to finish this space. It's always part art and part science to analyze these TI bids that come back, because you need to make sure they have proper cost allocation that's defined in the lease between ourselves and the landlord. But like mentioned in the slide a little bit earlier, expediency does cost money. So, it's even more of a deeper dive in the emergency method. Questions such as, how much should a compressed schedule cost when you're considering, quick mobilization of labor, faster shipping times on materials, possible need for night and weekend work to maintain the schedules that you set out for in your project plan. All those things will be critical to do this part well. And a consistent pointer here is get your most responsive and diligent reviewer in place, ready for this before the bids hit the desk. And generally, probably don't do this analysis in a vacuum. As the John Wooden quote said was, be quick, but don't hurry. Now for this one, how much time does this take? Well, doing any construction will add a significant amount of time to your schedule. We talked about it can take 1 to 2 months if you can take space as is, and that balloons out to 6 or more months once you decide to alter the building in a way that necessitates plans and construction. So any deviation from as is space triggers a number of critical path items that would need to be added to the project schedule. So. And I've personally led emergency lease projects that have had 24/7 around the clock work, overtime, weekends, and even with that level of support and funding, construction still takes months and months because of those material procurement lead times, labor mobilization, permitting times. Even when you have buy-in from the local government. So understand that when a team decides to change things in the space, that improvements in time, can be extremely expensive. And because every single event can then become a critical path item where, you can't move beyond, this specific milestone until, the previous one is done. You can eventually get to diminishing returns for your increased costs. So, as you kind of squeeze, or as you kind of put more money into it, you don't get as much time out as it if you at some point in the progress of the schedule expediency. So anyway, a good pointer here is to try to look for and accept as much space as possible, right? Even if it's just a portion of the floor plate, and you can phase the rest so you can be operational to kind of serve your stakeholders as soon as possible in the emergency space. So inspections are important on our construction projects, and they're extremely important when it becomes when we're talking about emergency lease actions. When you're analyzing when those inspections should take place, obviously you should look for times when there's any special equipment getting installed, or times where you can't go back and look later, like after the walls go up. These actions, the axiom where it's like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, definitely comes into play. Getting ahead of problems before they either get buttoned up in a wall or, especially cause, mid-construction demo to fix, obviously save you critical days in the emergency lease process. Now, once all those items are done, inspection and potential acceptance can occur. The team will walk the space, ensuring that it is substantially complete, which the definition is up on the screen. When confirmed as substantially complete, that means only minor punch items remain, and we can use the space for its purpose. And then eventually, because of that, the lease becomes effective and the rent commences. Upon substantially complete as well, we're able to move in our personal property, and that lease will transfer within GSA from the procurement team to the lease administration managers or LAMs. And it looks like we have another poll question here.
That's right, we do. I'm sorry, second, get off mute. These are a couple of knowledge checks as we near the end of the meat of the presentation. We want to make sure that folks have been paying attention along the way. We want to know, can you request an emergency lease because of pressure from senior management to get a new lease done quickly? This is a yes or no question, so I hope again that we have up to 100% participation. I'm seeing the results row in. There is an extraordinary swing in one direction here. We'll give everybody a few more moments to look up and hit yes or no. Can you request an emergency lease because of pressure from senior management to get a new lease done quickly? And overwhelmingly 94% say that no, you cannot. Charlie or Ken, not sure if either of you wants to weigh in on that. I think it's pretty self-evident.
I would just say, so that if you said yes, you have to review the presentation again.
And I will point out that we will be posting a recording of this on our YouTube page if you want to go back and hear where that was mentioned earlier. So we will get that poll question out, and we'll transition to a second poll question. This one refers to the earlier conversation about trigger events. And so we want to know, what are legitimate trigger events for an emergency lease? A building destroyed by fire. B, a mission critical deadline set by law. C, a hurricane that causes damage to a building that cannot be repaired in a reasonable time. Or D, all of the above. So again, if you can't see the pop-up on your screen, you can just post your response in the chat. Once again, what are legitimate trigger events for an emergency lease? A, building destroyed by fire. B, a mission critical deadline set by law. C, a hurricane that causes damage to a building but cannot be repaired in a reasonable time. Or D, all of the above. And I will reveal here that I accidentally closed my poll window. Oh, no, I think it popped back up for me here. And so once again, we have overwhelming support, 98% for all of the above. Just a couple of folks hitting a building destroyed by fire. Don't know if that was a selection or an error, but Charlie, Ken, anything you want to weigh in on those trigger events?
No, these are all legitimate trigger events. And this is part of why we want to have this presentation, because this is a great tool to have in the toolbox. Again, it has to be understood properly, but it looks like 98% got it right. The other few folks, they partially got it right. Maybe they just selected A because it was correct, and that was the first one, but looks like most folks understood this.
All right, well, thank you. I know we have a couple of ending slides here, but Ken and Charlie, before I do that, we do have time. I don't know if you wanted to take any additional questions or any other comments that you wanted to make before I take the steering wheel again here.
Okay, yeah, let's go through here, and we'll try to answer more of these types of questions as much as we can here live, and then we'll go ahead and close it out. Going through here, let me see if I can grab a couple of these. If an emergency occurs, there's an earthquake and we relocate you, and then they finish the build out or the repair, are you required to go back? Well, so if we knew we were going to have the space repaired within 270 days, then again, we would generally have procured for you temporary space, or we would have had, especially now in this post-COVID environment, we would have certainly talk to you as much as possible about just simply teleworking for that 270 days. But if for whatever reason we did get you temporary space with the idea that the landlord is expected to repair the premises within 270 days, you're going to have a very short-term lease. So you would essentially go back into the old space. And the new space would likely have been, again, a short-term lease that would have been very minimal build out. So hopefully, you like your old space when you move back. But yeah, we would have done a short-term lease for you, and then you would go back into your old space. Okay, there's a couple of questions here that I do want to touch on, especially because it's come up a few times, and it can be a very touchy subject about questions of crime and vandalism and things of that nature. Can vandalism trigger an emergency? I would say vandalism by itself, likely not. Is there a point at which your space becomes unsafe and we need to relocate you? The answer to that is yes. It certainly has happened in across our portfolio and in all of the years, and I have been involved in a situation where, just however it was, over a certain amount of time, the crime in an area continued to accelerate to a point where it was becoming a problem that meant that they were starting to have issues with people not wanting to go to work, people not feeling safe, being in that area, driving in that area. Part of this is we do long-term leases, and no one, of course, has a crystal ball of what is going to happen in an area, over the course of 10 or 15 or possibly 20 years. And so we certainly, when we place an agency to begin with, we want to place an agency in an area that we're comfortable having government employees work. Again, certainly we don't know what can happen over the course of a decade or two. What would have to happen in that situation is that FPS, Federal Protective Service, would have to get involved, and they would have to essentially make a determination that the area is no longer safe. And I have been through that situation where we had to relocate an agency due to that issue. Part of why I worked for years to create this process and to get it codified is that in the past, when those types of things happen, we didn't have a codified playbook for how to handle those things, and we now do with this new chapter of the Leasing Desk Guide. So My hope would be that in the future, if we had a situation like that, we would handle it. We would have a playbook, and we would go to this playbook and say, okay, we need to relocate this agency. It is a very subjective argument to make that this area is now unsafe. And it would have to be based on, hard data. It would have to be based on an expert's assessment, again, generally Federal Protective Service. FPS is in charge of security at leased locations. So they would be the experts that could come in and look at the data. The answer is that, can safety concerns trigger an emergency lease? The answer is that it is possible. Again, it would be something that would have to be done in as much of an objective manner, not a subjective manner, not simply that something happened. But I certainly, I don't want to say that these issues are trivial, because they're not. If you're somebody that has to go to work in a space that is in an area that makes you feel unsafe, that is certainly a very serious issue. So we would likely, work with FPS. It would be something that would have to, again, be discussed at very high levels. But certainly you could arrive at a conclusion that we need to do an emergency relocation and get agency new space. Okay. Again, there's a follow-up question. Does the agency get out of the lease? Again, that would be something that would be based on what is the request, what is the justification, and how much time is left. There may be certain financial obligations, or there may not. There's no way to necessarily just say definitively yes or no. Those are not things that happen a lot, because we go through a process when we locate agencies. If the space is not safe, we would not put you there. But again, over a long period of time, you can have a change in the character of an area. So it can happen. But sometimes it's hard to just say definitively it would be this or it would be that. It would certainly be something that would have to be looked at on a very, very case-by-case basis. All right. How long does it take to set up a short-term lease? Well, when we do this for FEMA and they take it as is, we do it hopefully within a couple of days. But FEMA is kind of, they're an agency that is built to move very, very quickly. I would say that it's really about from the time that we have good requirements. A short-term lease, no build out, it's short-term, that would generally be less than 18 months. We have some very quick and very shortened lease documents that we can use, where we're actually designed to get bids in the field that are filled out by hand. It could be a couple of weeks, it could be 30 days. It's really hard to answer the questions of, how long does it take, because it's based on so many variables. Again, that question of, how much does a car cost? But it certainly, short-term leases, no build out, from the time we have good requirements. Again, a key issue, from the time we have good requirements, short-term as is space. I mean, it could be something that we do in a week or two. I would hope that we could get it done in that time frame. All right. Let me see if there's one here. Can other federal agency regulations trigger the need for an emergency lease? OSHA. If OSHA determines that the space is unsafe for occupancy, absolutely. There's one word that I purposefully didn't put in the slides that was mold. And the reason is that I almost, it's like I didn't want to invoke the ghost there. But what happens if you have OSHA issues? And again, the space becomes unsafe. If the space becomes unsafe because of OSHA issues, then absolutely that. In fact, there have been emergency leases done because of issues having to do with the safety and the health of the occupants. I've been involved in a couple of those. So yes, the answer is yes, it can trigger the need for an emergency lease. Let's see if I can find one here. There's one for Ken. Good. When you are estimating the length of the emergency lease, are there guidelines we should use to determine the length? Say the emergency lease is created by being forced to vacate a premises by the landlord. Okay, well, actually, hopefully the landlord's not forcing us to vacate the premises, because if we have a lease, then they can't force us out of it. And there's another question in the Q&A box that is somewhat similar about if a building is sold and the new landlord wants us out. If the building is sold, or if the landlord wants to demolish the site, they have a lease. They have a contract with the federal government. Even if the building is sold, our lease is going to survive that sale. So they can't necessarily force us out. So we shouldn't be in a situation where we are being forced out of space by a landlord. If we have a lease that has term left, they cannot force us out, and that's just something that shouldn't be happening. As far as estimating the length of an emergency lease, I mean, the guidelines would be to match the need. If it's short term, if it's short term and you're going to move back into space, we're going to match the term, maybe with a little bit of overhang, but we're going to match the term to the length of the repair. If it's long-term space, we're probably going to be looking at something that is 5, 10, possibly 15, or again, the maximum would be 20 years. Probably a long-term emergency lease is probably going to be sort of in that middle of 10 years. All right.
There's a good question here, Charlie, about managing telecom at the same time. And this is a really good point that I don't think we talked a lot about, which is, well, we talked about working with the various people in your team, but making sure your schedules merge and that they have also the sense of urgency for to be up and ready. The substantial completion can occur when not necessarily when you have all of your your personal property items in, but these are the things that you absolutely should think about along the way to make sure that it's space you can work in.
Absolutely. And like we talked about, I mean, a lot of times leveraging this authority and actually getting value out of it means coming out of your comfort zone. It means that things that normally take 30 days might need to be done in a week. Those are the types of things that have to be done. But that's also something that we would talk about in the scheduling portion. Very much at the beginning, your project manager will come in and go through a schedule with you. And if there are certain things that you just say absolutely cannot be expedited, then, if you understand, scheduling, what's going to happen is you're going to start to have certain pathways in the schedule that have tons of float. And then we're going to start to look at this and say, well, okay, gosh, we're going to race through these activities, but then we're going to run into this other activity on the critical path that just is 3-4 months long. So then all of a sudden, you're going to run into, I'm racing through this activity, but then I'm going to hit this long period of gap while I'm waiting on this other activity. And so again, you're going to have some activities with a lot of float, and then you're going to start to go, well, then do I really need to race through this other activity? Do I really need an emergency lease? Or is it that I'm just simply, I need to use full and open competition, but again, maybe do faster than normal full and open competition. Full and open competition can be met going very quickly, honestly. And that's where, again, we talk about that idea of the spectrum. So all I can say is that, I can't really say, would they have to move faster than this many days? The answer is probably, but I mean, that is something that you would have to look at with your schedule. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? If you need to be in the space within, 30 days or 60 days, then we're going to need something done so that you're driving this request. The agency is coming to us and saying, I have an emergency. I have to have this space, and I have to have it, in 30 days, or I have to have it in 60 days or 90 days or whatever it is. So again, that's where we're going to have to look at the schedule and are you going to have to expedite it? Maybe. Maybe not. I mean, if you're getting into build out and we have 10, normally maybe it's 6 months of build out. So if we have 6 months of build out and we're expediting that to 4 months of build out, then you still have 90 days to do a phone system. So maybe not. Again, it's kind of hard to answer that in the abstract, but I mean, the idea is that all of your people, all of your group should be prepared if there is a true emergency to work, faster than they might be expected to work normally. But would they have to definitively expedite that time frame? Perhaps, but perhaps not. Again, it would be, very much schedule dependent. All right. Is there any here, Ken, that you see that you'd like to take?
No, but it's kind of funny that it's like the expectations when we start doing this job. I think in many cases is like people shop for space, or they want to they consider this space like they were looking for their apartment. Like I expect this apartment to be ready as soon as possible, and then they learn, of course, about SECA and all of our procurement rules, and we give people all this time to return offers back. And now it's almost like in this scenario, you're kind of like morphing back into like those days where you were shopping for an apartment where you can take it right away. But the issue is, of course, like the more build out you have in it, the more you're going to push that date out for when you can actually take it. So it's just about those comfort zone things that we talked about before.
All right, I'll take one here. Do emergency lease rules apply to historic buildings? Well, I mean, the emergency lease process is an acquisition process. So, I mean, a historic building certainly could give us an offer, faster than normal. As far as if they're a historic building, typically we would work with our historic preservation officer within the region about, there might be certain requirements within the RLP and lease that they can't make or they can't meet those requirements because of the historic character of their building. And then what we would do is we would really apply our normal process of working with historic buildings. Again, we just have to do it very quickly, where our historic preservation officer would have to look at what it is that the building says they can't do. They say, look, I don't have 9.5 foot ceilings. I have 8 foot ceilings, and they're beautiful and they're historic, and I can't demo these beautiful hard ceilings and put in a tile grid. And then we would simply work with our historic preservation officer about, well, is this something that we can live with? And in many cases, the answer is yes, we can. We do a lot of leases in historic buildings. A lot of times, again, we build our requirements around the idea of a quote modern office building. But again, starting my career in Philadelphia, I mean, historic buildings are everywhere. So, we can normally work with a historic building. We can find another way to accommodate the historic nature. And if the answer is that a historic building truly can't meet our requirements and there's just no way around it, I mean, then that building wouldn't meet our requirements and we would have to find other space. But in almost all instances, I mean, there's ways to deal with that. If you don't have if you don't have room above the ceiling, you can use raised flooring and you can run your cable below the floor. So, again, we would handle a historic building the same way we normally would. Again, just that whole idea of moving a lot faster. All right.
Hey, Charlie, I want to jump in here because we are getting down to the end of our time, and I want to just acknowledge where we are on the clock. And I know we have questions left in the Q&A, but I will jump in to say that if we did not get to your question live, so to speak, we will absolutely be pulling them out and putting them into our Q&A document. So unfortunately, we got a great amount of questions and some comprehensive answers, but we are nearing the end, so I do want to move on. And I want to acknowledge the slide that's been on the screen while we've been doing Q&A. This is not just about emergency leases, but about lease projects as well as RWA projects in general. It's about our Project Pulse survey, and hopefully you have read what it is about while we've been chatting back and forth here. But if you are a point of contact in a customer agency for a lease or RWA project with GSA, you will receive a link to this Project Pulse survey. It is very simple. I have taken beta tests of this. It takes approximately 15 to 20 seconds if you're pressed for time, and it's just a quick pulse check on your satisfaction with how we are doing our work on the projects. And we take that information, aggregate it, and it really helps us look into best practices and make our projects more efficient and successful moving forward. But with that, we're at 2:57 Eastern time. So I do want to take a moment now to thank both Ken and Charlie for this fantastic, very informative session. I think this is the first time we've done this in at least quite some time, if not at all. So I appreciate it. I want to thank all of our customers, not just for being here today, but for also submitting questions. I sit through some of these sessions and we don't get many. There were a lot of questions. We could have extended this all afternoon. So I want to thank you for that. And Ken, I think if you're still running the slides, can you jump ahead too? Because I do want to get to the final slide here. We have several, as you can see, additional client enrichment series presentations coming up. I think we must be out of leave already because we are here all summer. Coming back next week with RWA Fundamentals on Thursday, July 21st. Then we have the Workplace Feasibility Modeling Made Easy with WIFM 2.0, and that is Wednesday, July 27th. If you attended our PBS customer forum last month, you heard about this tool. We will have Ryan Dorfler here to talk about this space utilization tool that customer agencies can use for their planning processes. We have everyone's favorite e-Rita Digest, our quarterly class on Tuesday, August 9th at 1 p.m. And then we are going to say aloha to Kahua. Kahua is our new project management software platform that is coming online soon. So we are going to have an introduction to that on Thursday, August 18th. You can learn more and register online at www.gsa.gov/CES. One more time, a thanks to Charlie and Ken. One more time, a thanks to everybody. And one more reminder that we will get to all of those questions that you asked, those we did answer and those we did not get to answer. We will turn them into an FAQ document and make that available to you after the fact today. So on behalf of myself and all of the Client Enrichment Series teams, I do want to thank everybody for coming today and remind you that the goal of the Client Enrichment Series is to engage our audience in workplace topics that contribute to your mission success and to your effective management of your real estate and workplace programs. Please have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you at some of our upcoming sessions this summer. Thank you very much.